The sound of rain against bulletproof glass echoes through the marble lobby of Sterling and Associates. Today, my family gathers to divide $15 million they believe belongs to them. They've spent months planning, scheming, ensuring I get nothing. What they don't know is that 6 months ago, their golden goose already chose me. My name is Deborah Chen, and this is the story of how blood doesn't always run thicker than greed, and how sometimes the person you underestimate holds all the cards. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The elevator climbed 37 floors in complete silence, each number lighting up like a countdown to something inevitable. Through the polished steel doors, I caught fragments of my reflection: navy blazer, pearl earrings that belonged to my grandmother, and eyes that had learned to hide everything. The law offices of Sterling and Associates occupied the entire top floor of the Meridian Tower in downtown Chicago, glass walls offering a view of Lake Michigan that stretched beyond the horizon. I stepped into the reception area, where crystal chandeliers cast geometric shadows across Persian rugs worth more than most people's cars. The receptionist, a woman with silver hair pulled into a perfect chignon, looked up from her mahogany desk. "Miss Chen, they're waiting for you in conference room A." Her tone carried the kind of professional neutrality that barely masked pity. She'd probably seen this before: families tearing each other apart over money, lawyers counting billable hours while hearts broke in leather chairs. I thanked her and walked down the corridor, my heels making soft clicks against the marble floor. Oil paintings of long-dead judges and politicians lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow my progress toward whatever waited behind those mahogany doors. Through the frosted glass, I could make out shapes: my family, already assembled, already comfortable in their certainty about how today would unfold. I paused for a moment, hand resting on the brass handle, remembering the last time we'd all been in the same room together. It was Thanksgiving, 8 months ago, at the family estate in Lake Forest. The house where I'd grown up, where every room held memories of feeling like an outsider at my own dining table. My stepmother Patricia had made it clear, with her subtle comments and strategic seating arrangements, that I was tolerated but not treasured. My half-siblings, Marcus and Victoria, had perfected the art of looking through me rather than at me, as if acknowledging my presence might somehow diminish their own importance. But Eleanor, my father's mother, the woman who'd built the Chen fortune from a single dry-cleaning shop into a textile empire, had always been different. While the rest of the family saw me as an inconvenience, a reminder of my father's first marriage to a woman they'd rather forget, Eleanor saw something else. "You have your mother's eyes," she'd told me once, when I was 12 and crying in the garden after Patricia had forgotten to include me in the family Christmas card photo. She could see straight through pretense. "Don't ever let them dull that gift, Deborah." Now Eleanor was gone, and I was about to face the vultures who'd circled her hospital bed for the last 2 years, whispering about wills and trusts and who deserved what. I pushed open the door. The conference room was a study in power and intimidation: floor-to-ceiling windows, a table that could seat 20, and walls lined with law books that probably hadn't been opened in decades. At the head of the table sat Harold Sterling himself, a man whose reputation for handling high-stakes estate disputes was legendary throughout Chicago's elite circles. To his right, Patricia occupied her chair like a throne, her blonde hair styled in the same perfect bob she'd worn for 20 years. At 55, she'd mastered the art of looking both elegant and predatory, her manicured fingers drumming against the table with practiced impatience. She wore a black Chanel suit, appropriate for mourning, if mourning was something she was actually doing. Marcus sat beside her, all sharp angles and entitled posture. At 32, he'd never worked a day in his life, living off trust fund distributions and Patricia's careful management of family connections. His wife, Ashley, sat next to him, diamond tennis bracelet catching the light as she scrolled through her phone with barely concealed boredom. Victoria commanded the other side of the table, her red hair pulled back in a severe bun that made her look older than her 28 years.
She'd always been the smart one, the one who'd graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern before taking a position at a prestigious investment firm. A position, everyone whispered, she'd gotten through Eleanor's connections rather than her own merit. They all looked up when I entered, their expressions ranging from mild annoyance to outright hostility. Patricia's smile was particularly sharp. "Deborah, how lovely! We were beginning to think you'd changed your mind about coming." I took the seat at the far end of the table, as far from the rest of them as possible. It was a deliberate choice, one that didn't go unnoticed. "I wouldn't miss this," I said quietly.
Victoria leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "Well, this should be quick enough. We all know what Eleanor's will says." Marcus nodded, adjusting his tie. "The estate gets divided among the primary beneficiaries. Patricia gets the Lake Forest house, Vicky gets the investment portfolio, I get the business interests." He glanced at me with what might have been sympathy if it weren't so obviously performed. "There might be something small for you, Deb, maybe some jewelry or personal effects." Ashley looked up from her phone long enough to add, "It's really sweet that she thought of you at all, considering." Considering. The word hung in the air like smoke from a cigarette no one wanted to claim. Considering I wasn't Patricia's daughter. Considering my mother had died when I was 7. Considering I'd spent the last 15 years watching my father's second family treat his first family like an embarrassing mistake. Harold Sterling cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the family dynamics like a judge's gavel. "If we could begin," he said, opening a leather portfolio, "I have the last will and testament of Eleanor Chen, witnessed and notarized according to Illinois state law." Patricia straightened in her chair, practically vibrating with anticipation. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the official confirmation of her place in the Chen dynasty, the legal blessing that would secure her children's futures and cement her own position as the family matriarch. "The will is dated 18 months ago," Sterling continued, "and was updated several times in the months before Mrs. Chen's passing." Several times. That was news to everyone except me. I saw Patricia's eyebrow twitch, saw Marcus and Victoria exchange glances. "Updated how?" Victoria asked. Sterling's expression remained neutral. "All details will be covered in the formal reading. However, I should mention that Mrs. Chen also left several sealed letters to be distributed after the will has been read in full." Letters? I felt something cold settle in my stomach, though whether it was dread or anticipation, I couldn't say. The lawyer began to read, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of legal formality. "I, Eleanor Chen, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath." As his words filled the room, I let my mind drift back to 6 months ago, to the afternoon that had changed everything. Eleanor had called me to her penthouse overlooking Lincoln Park, ostensibly for our usual Sunday tea. But when I arrived, she was sitting at her antique writing desk, fountain pen in hand, looking frailer than I'd ever seen her. "Sit down, darling," she'd said, not looking up from whatever she was writing. "We need to talk." I'd taken the chair across from her, the same chair where she'd taught me to play chess when I was 9, where she'd helped me with calculus homework in high school, where she'd held me while I cried about my father's increasing distance after his remarriage. "Your family," she'd begun, then stopped, shaking her head. "Patricia's children. They think they know what's coming." "Eleanor, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." Her voice was firm, the same tone she'd used in boardrooms for 60 years. "I have to tell you, before it's too late, before the lawyers and the vultures make it impossible to speak plainly." She'd set down her pen and looked at me directly, her pale blue eyes still sharp despite her 86 years. "They've been visiting more lately. Patricia brings flowers and asks about my comfort. Marcus talks about carrying on the family legacy. Victoria discusses investment strategies." She'd smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "They think they're being subtle." I'd known what she meant. The sudden increase in family dinners, the concerned phone calls, the way Patricia had started including Eleanor's favorite foods at holiday meals.
It was a campaign, carefully orchestrated and transparently desperate. But you see them, Eleanor had continued. You always have. That's why your mother loved you so much, Deborah. That's why I do. Back in the conference room, Sterling's voice brought me to the present. He was reading through the standard legal language, the whereases and heretofores that made everything sound official and final. But I was waiting for the part that mattered, the part that would change everything. Patricia was leaning forward now, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Marcus had stopped fidgeting with his tie. Victoria's phone lay forgotten on the mahogany surface. To my daughter-in-law, Patricia Chen, I leave my collection of vintage brooches and the sum of $50,000.
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. This silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's face went through several colors: confusion, disbelief, and finally, a dangerous shade of red. "That can't be right," she said. Sterling continued without acknowledging her. "To my grandson, Marcus Chen, I leave my late husband's watch collection and the sum of $50,000. Marcus actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "This is a joke, right? She's leaving me a bunch of old watches?" "To my granddaughter, Victoria Chen, I leave my library of first edition books and the sum of $50,000. Victoria stood up so fast her chair rolled backward. "This is insane. The estate is worth $50 million. What about the house, the business, the investment accounts?" Harold Sterling set down the will and looked around the table with the expression of a man who'd delivered this kind of news before. "The remainder of the estate, including all real property, business interests, investment accounts, and liquid assets, goes to the sole primary beneficiary." The room held its breath. Deborah Chen. The words hung in the air like a detonation waiting to reach everyone's ears. Deborah Chen, primary beneficiary, $50 million. For a moment, the conference room existed in a vacuum of disbelief. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, indifferent to the explosion of human emotion about to unfold. Outside, Chicago traffic hummed 37 floors below, oblivious to the family dynasty imploding behind bulletproof glass. Patricia was the first to break. "That's impossible." Her voice cracked on the second word, years of careful composure shattering like expensive porcelain hitting marble. "Harold, there has to be a mistake. Check the date, check the signature. This isn't the will we discussed." Harold Sterling adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and reopened the leather portfolio. "Mrs. Chen, I assure you this is the legally binding last will and testament of Eleanor Chen, executed properly under Illinois state law. The document was updated 6 months ago in my presence with 2 witnesses and a notary public." 6 months ago? I watched the calculation dawn on their faces. 6 months ago was when Eleanor's health had taken a sudden turn for the worse, when the family visits had increased, when Patricia had started bringing those elaborate flower arrangements twice a week. Marcus shot up from his chair, his face flushed red. "This is fraud. She was sick, confused, probably medicated. There's no way she would leave everything to—" He gestured at me like I was something distasteful stuck to his shoe. "To what, Marcus?" I asked quietly, speaking for the first time since Sterling's announcement. "You are not family," Victoria spat, her investment banker composure cracking to reveal something uglier underneath. "You're the daughter of Dad's first wife. Eleanor was being manipulated by guilt and some misguided sense of obligation to your dead mother." Ashley looked up from where she'd been frantically typing on her phone, probably already calculating how this would affect their lifestyle. "Can we contest this? I mean, there has to be grounds.
Undue influence or diminished capacity or something? Patricia stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. When she spoke, her voice carried the cold precision of someone accustomed to getting her way through sheer force of will. Deborah, I don't know what you said to Eleanor in her final months, what lies you fed her about us, but this is unconscionable. This family has given you everything, a home, an education, opportunities you never would have had otherwise. The audacity was breathtaking. I remained seated, hands folded in my lap, watching her performance with the detached interest of someone observing wildlife. A home? I repeated. Is that what you call it when you move me to the servants' quarters after you redecorated? An education? You mean the one Eleanor paid for privately because you convinced my father I should attend public school while Marcus and Victoria went to Philip's Exeter? Patricia's jaw tightened. We provided for you according to your position in this family. My position? I smiled, and something about that expression made Marcus take a step back. You know exactly what I mean. Say it. My voice carried a steel edge I'd inherited from Eleanor, though I'd never known it until now. Say what you've been thinking for 15 years, but never had the courage to voice. The silence stretched taut as a wire. Victoria's hands clenched into fists. Marcus looked between his mother and me like he was watching a tennis match that might turn violent. Ashley had stopped typing entirely. You, Patricia began, then stopped, seeming to realize she was standing at the edge of a cliff. I finished for her, the reminder, the evidence of my father's life before you, the inconvenient proof that the Chen family didn't begin with your marriage, the daughter who looked too much like her mother for you to ever forget that you were the second choice. Patricia's composure finally shattered completely. How dare you? After everything we've done for you, after we welcomed you into our home when your mother died. Welcome me? I stood up slowly, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt the full weight of Eleanor's legacy settling on my shoulders. You mean after my father was too grief-stricken to function and Eleanor insisted I stay with family instead of going to foster care? After she threatened to disinherit him if he didn't step up as a parent? The color drained from Patricia's face. That particular family history had been carefully buried, never discussed in polite company. You didn't think I knew, I continued, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. But Eleanor told me everything, how you made it clear from day one that I was a temporary inconvenience, how you convinced my father that showing me too much attention would be unfair to your own children, how you slowly, systematically erased every trace of my mother from that house. Marcus found his voice. We never. The photos, Marcus. One day they were on the mantelpiece, the next they were gone. My mother's piano, sold while I was at summer camp. Her jewelry, donated to charity before I was old enough to appreciate it. Did you think a 7-year-old wouldn't notice her mother disappearing piece by piece? Harold Sterling cleared his throat. Perhaps we should continue with the legal formalities. There are additional provisions in the will that need to be addressed. But the room had become a pressure cooker of 15 years' worth of buried resentment and unspoken truths. Victoria stepped forward, her face twisted with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. You manipulative little snake. You played the victim so perfectly, didn't you? Poor little orphan Deborah, making Eleanor feel guilty about how we supposedly treated you. You poisoned her against us.
I never had to poison anyone against you, Victoria. You did that all by yourselves. This is absurd, Ashley interjected, her voice shrill. Marcus, do something. Call your lawyer. This can't be legal. Marcus was pacing now, running his hands through his hair. There has to be a way to fight this. We can claim emotional distress, undue influence. Deborah obviously took advantage of an elderly woman's deteriorating mental state. I laughed, a sound that surprised even me. Eleanor's mental state was sharper than all of yours combined until the day she died. She spoke 3 languages fluently, managed her own investment portfolio, and could recall details from business deals she made 40 years ago. The only thing deteriorating was her patience with your transparent greed. Patricia slammed her hand on the mahogany table, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. Enough! Harold, I want this to be contested immediately. I want psychiatric evaluations of Eleanor's mental state in her final months. I want every interaction between her and Deborah examined for signs of manipulation. Harold Sterling's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught a flicker of something that might have been amusement. Mrs. Chen, you are certainly within your rights to contest the will. However, I should mention that Mrs. Eleanor Chen anticipated such a possibility. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew another document, this one significantly thicker than the will. She prepared what she called an insurance policy, a comprehensive psychological evaluation conducted by 3 independent psychiatrists, testing conducted over several months to establish her mental competency, video testimonials explaining her reasoning for each bequest, detailed documentation of every family interaction in her final year, including dates, times, and witnesses. The blood drained from Patricia's face. She was investigating us? She was protecting her final wishes, Sterling replied simply. Mrs. Chen was quite thorough. She also provided extensive documentation of family financial history, including previous gifts, loans, and educational expenses provided to each family member over the past 20 years. Marcus stopped pacing. What do you mean, documentation? Sterling opened the thick folder and began reading from what appeared to be a ledger. Private school tuition for Marcus and Victoria Chen, $180,000 each. College tuition and expenses, $240,000 each. Graduate school for Victoria, $150,000. Startup capital for Marcus's failed restaurant venture, $500,000. Down payment on Marcus and Ashley's Lincoln Park condo, $300,000. Victoria's investment in her friend's boutique, $200,000. He looked up from the papers. The total comes to approximately $1.8 million in gifts and financial support provided to Patricia's children over the past 15 years. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. In contrast, Sterling continued, educational expenses for Deborah Chen were paid directly to institutions to ensure the funds reached their intended purpose. Total expenditure, $85,000 for undergraduate degree. No additional loans or financial support provided. Ashley's mouth hung open. Victoria had gone pale. Marcus was staring at the folder like it contained evidence of war crimes. She kept track of everything, Patricia whispered. Mrs. Chen was a businesswoman, Sterling replied. She kept meticulous records of all family financial transactions. She also documented her attempts to include Deborah in family gatherings, noting dates when invitations were extended and declined on Deborah's behalf by other family members. I felt something cold settle in my chest. What do you mean declined on my behalf? Sterling consulted another page. Multiple birthday parties, holiday celebrations, and family vacations. Invitations extended by Mrs. Chen, regrets sent by Patricia Chen, citing various reasons why Deborah would be unable to attend. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. All those times I'd wondered why Eleanor never invited me to family events. All those holidays I'd spent alone in my apartment, thinking I wasn't wanted. The growing distance I'd felt from the grandmother who'd raised me after my mother's death. You told her I didn't want to come, I said, looking directly at Patricia. Patricia's silence was enough. Marcus made one last desperate play.
Even if all of this is true, even if Mom made some mistakes, this doesn't justify Eleanor cutting us out entirely. We're her grandchildren. This estate should stay in the family. I looked at him for a long moment, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Not the entitled stepbrother who'd made my teenage years miserable, not the privileged prince who'd never worked for anything in his life. Just a man, facing the consequences of his choices. Marcus, I said quietly, I am family. Harold Sterling closed the folder and looked around the table. If there are no further questions about the will itself, I have several sealed letters that Mrs. Chen requested be distributed. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew 4 cream-colored envelopes, each bearing a name in Eleanor's distinctive handwriting. One for Patricia, one for Marcus, one for Victoria, and one for me. Harold Sterling held the 4 envelopes like a dealer preparing to show his final hand. The cream-colored paper seemed to glow under the conference room's recessed lighting, each name written in Eleanor's unmistakable script, flowing, confident, with just enough flourish to remind you that this was a woman who'd built an empire with nothing but determination and a sharp mind. He set them on the mahogany table with deliberate precision. Patricia's letter lay closest to her, but she made no move to reach for it. Her hands remained clenched in her lap, knuckles white against the black fabric of her Chanel suit. Mrs. Chen requested that these be read aloud, Sterling announced, breaking the oppressive silence that had settled over the room like fog. Victoria let out a bitter laugh. Of course she did. Even in death, Eleanor has to have the last word. Sterling's expression remained impassive, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of disapproval that suggested he genuinely respected Eleanor Chen, not just her billable hours. I'll begin with the letter addressed to Patricia Chen, he said, breaking the seal with a silver letter opener. Patricia straightened in her chair, her mask of composure sliding back into place. Whatever Eleanor had written, she was preparing to face it with the same calculated dignity she'd used to navigate country club politics for 20 years. Sterling unfolded the letter, the paper making a soft whisper in the silent room. When he began to read, his voice carried Eleanor's cadence so perfectly that for a moment it felt like she was speaking from beyond the grave. My dear Patricia, I want to begin by acknowledging that you gave my son something I couldn't, a second chance of happiness after Sandra's death. For that, I was always grateful. Patricia's shoulders relaxed slightly. Perhaps this wouldn't be the character assassination she'd feared. However, Sterling continued, and the word hung in the air like a blade, gratitude and approval are not the same thing. Over the past 15 years, I watched you systematically erase my daughter-in-law's memory from our family home. I watched you treat her daughter not as a stepchild to be loved, but as competition to be diminished. The color drained from Patricia's face. You convinced Robert that showing too much attention to Deborah would somehow hurt Marcus and Victoria, as if love were a finite resource that had to be rationed. You declined family invitations on her behalf without consulting her. You moved her to the smaller bedroom when she was 14, claiming Marcus needed more space for his college preparations. You sold Sandra's piano, the piano Sandra played for Deborah every night before bed, and told Robert it was taking up too much room. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Ashley had stopped looking at her phone entirely. I said nothing because I hoped you would grow into the role of stepmother with grace and time. Instead, you grew into resentment. You taught your children to see Deborah as an outsider in her own family. You made her childhood smaller to make room for your own ambitions. Sterling paused, glancing at Patricia, whose face had gone ashen. You are not a cruel woman, Patricia, but you are a calculating one. And in your calculations, a grieving child was always an acceptable loss if it meant securing your own children's positions. That is why you received $50,000 and my brooch collection, not as punishment, but as reflection. You valued appearances over substance, jewelry over character. I leave you what you treasured most. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia sat frozen, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her like a house of cards in a windstorm. Sterling set down the first letter and reached for the second. Marcus Chen. Marcus tried to appear nonchalant, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed against the table in the same nervous rhythm he'd had since childhood. My dear grandson, I remember the day you were born, how proud your grandfather was, how he talked about teaching you the business, about carrying on the Chen legacy. You were born into privilege, Marcus, but somewhere along the way, you mistook privilege for entitlement. Marcus's drumming stopped. I paid for your education at Phillips Exeter, your undergraduate degree at Northwestern, your failed MBA program at Wharton. I gave you startup capital for 3 different business ventures, watched you squander each opportunity with poor planning and poor judgment. When you opened the restaurant, I didn't just provide money. I connected you with suppliers, recommended experienced managers, even sent customers your way. It failed not because of market conditions or bad luck, but because you treated it like a hobby instead of a responsibility. Ashley shot Marcus a look that could have frozen Lake Michigan. You spent your 20s acting like success was your birthright rather than something to be earned. You married a woman who sees you as a trust fund rather than a partner, and you've never asked yourself if you might be worth more than your bank account. I leave you your grandfather's watches because time is the only thing I couldn't buy you more of. Perhaps now you'll learn to value it. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is ridiculous. She's attacking us from beyond the grave, and we're supposed to sit here and take it? Sit down, Marcus, Patricia hissed, but her voice lacked its usual authority. Sterling didn't wait for Marcus to comply. He simply moved to the third letter, the one addressed to Victoria. Victoria sat rigidly upright, her red hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch the skin around her temples. She'd always prided herself on being the smart one, the achiever, the daughter who'd actually made something of herself in the professional world. My dear Victoria, of all my grandchildren, you showed the most promise. Your mind is sharp, your ambition fierce, your potential unlimited. That's what makes your choices so deeply disappointing. Victoria's composure cracked slightly, a muscle twitching in her cheek. You graduated summa cum laude, but not through your own efforts alone. I provided private tutors, test preparation, connections for internships. I opened doors that would have remained locked to someone without the Chen name. You've built a successful career at Morrison & Associates, but you've done so by stepping on others rather than lifting them up. Sterling glanced up briefly before continuing. I know about the Henderson account, Victoria. I know you took credit for Sarah Mitchell's research and let her take the blame when the client complained about the strategy. I know about the promotion you received after having drinks with the managing partner's wife and strategically mentioning your concerns about your colleague's reliability. Intelligence without integrity is just clever sociopathy. Victoria's face flushed red, whether from anger or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. You've become everything I feared you would, brilliant but ruthless, successful but soulless. You look at Deborah and see someone who achieved less with more advantages, never recognizing that she achieved peace while you achieved only ambition. I leave you my first edition books because knowledge without wisdom is just expensive decoration. Victoria's hands were shaking now, but she remained silent. Sterling set down the third letter and looked directly at me. The envelope bearing my name seemed heavier than the others, though I knew that was impossible. Deborah Chen, he said softly. My throat felt dry, but I nodded for him to continue. Around the table, my family, my stepfamily, watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. They wanted to know what Eleanor had said about me, what justification she'd provided for her shocking decision. Sterling opened my letter with the same care he'd shown the others, but when he began to read, his voice carried a different quality, gentler, warmer, like Eleanor speaking directly to me across the void of death. My dearest Deborah, if you are hearing this letter, then I am gone, and you are sitting in a room full of people who never learned to see your worth. I want to begin by saying something I should have said more often while I was alive. I am proud of you. My eyes stung, but I refused to let the tears fall. Not here, not in front of them. When your mother died, you were 7 years old and completely alone in a world that suddenly made no sense. Your father retreated into his grief, Patricia saw you an obstacle to her own happiness, and Robert's other children viewed you as competition for resources they'd never had to share before. But you survived it all, with a grace that would have made Sandra weep with pride. I could feel Patricia's eyes boring into me, but I kept my gaze fixed on Sterling's face. I watched you navigate your teenage years without the guidance most children take for granted. I saw you work part-time jobs to pay for college expenses that Marcus and Victoria never had to consider. I observed you build relationships based on genuine affection rather than financial benefit. You chose a career in social work, not because it would make you wealthy, but because it would let you help children who'd faced the same abandonment you experienced. Sterling paused, looking at me with something that might have been paternal affection. You never asked me for money, never manipulated family situations for your own benefit, never played the victim despite having more reason than most to feel victimized. When I was hospitalized last year, you were the only one who visited without an agenda. You came to sit with an old woman and ask how she was feeling, not to position yourself for inheritance considerations. Marcus made a derisive sound, but it sounded hollow even to his own ears. That's why I'm leaving you everything, Deborah. Not to hurt the others, though they'll see it that way. Not to reward you for being my favorite, though you were. I'm leaving you my life's work because you're the only one who understands that wealth is a responsibility, not just a privilege.
The letter continued, but Sterling's words began to blur together as the magnitude of Eleanor's faith in me settled over my shoulders like a mantle I wasn't sure I deserved. When he finished reading, the conference room fell into a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Patricia stared at her hands. Marcus had slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon. Victoria looked like she was calculating odds and finding them all against her. Ashley was the first to speak, her voice sharp with disbelief. That's it? That's Eleanor's grand explanation? Deborah gets everything because she visited the hospital? She gets everything, I said quietly, speaking for the first time since the letters began, because I never tried to take it. My words seemed to echo in the conference room long after I'd spoken them. The truth had a weight to it, settling over the mahogany table like dust after an explosion. Patricia sat frozen, her perfectly manicured fingers pressed against her temples as if she could physically hold her world together through sheer will. Victoria was the first to recover, her investment banker instincts kicking in, even as her personal world crumbled. This is all very touching, but Eleanor was clearly suffering from some form of cognitive decline. No rational person leaves $50 million to someone based on hospital visits and sentimental feelings. Harold Sterling reached into his briefcase once more, his movements deliberate and practiced. As I mentioned earlier, Mrs. Chen anticipated challenges to her mental competency. He withdrew a thick manila folder and set it on the table with a soft thud. This contains comprehensive psychiatric evaluations conducted by Dr. James Morrison at Northwestern Memorial, Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation, at Rush University Medical Center, and Dr. Michael Rodriguez at Chicago Presbyterian. All 3 evaluations were conducted independently over a 6-month period. He opened the folder, revealing pages of medical documentation, cognitive test results, and official letterhead. Each evaluation concluded that Mrs. Chen possessed full mental capacity and showed no signs of dementia, Alzheimer's, or any other cognitive impairment. Her scores on memory, reasoning, and judgment tests were in the 95th percentile for her age group. Marcus leaned forward, desperation creeping into his voice.
Doctors can be bought. Everyone knows that. With Eleanor's money, she could have found psychiatrists willing to say whatever she wanted. Sterling's expression remained neutral, but there was a steel edge to his voice when he responded. Mr. Chen, are you suggesting that 3 of Chicago's most respected neuropsychiatrists, 2 of whom have testified in landmark legal cases, and 1 who serves on the American Psychiatric Association's ethics board, would risk their careers and professional reputations for financial gain? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus's face reddened, but he had no answer. Ashley, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly stood up. I can't sit here and listen to this anymore. Marcus, we need to leave, now. But Marcus wasn't ready to surrender. No, Ash, this is our future we're talking about, our children's future. He turned to me, his eyes blazing with an anger I'd never seen before. Deborah, you can't seriously be planning to take all of this. We grew up together. We're family. There it was, the word they'd never used to describe me before today. Now that $50 million hung in the balance, suddenly I was family again. We grew up in the same house, Marcus, I replied quietly. That's not the same thing as growing up together. Patricia finally found her voice, though it came out strained and hollow. What do you want, Deborah? Money? Is that what this is all about? Fine, we can work something out. A reasonable distribution of the estate. Surely you don't need all $50 million. The offer was pathetic and insulting in equal measure, but there was something else behind it. Genuine fear. For the first time in her adult life, Patricia faced a situation she couldn't manipulate, couldn't control, couldn't charm her way through. I don't want your money, Patricia, I said, and I meant it. I never wanted Eleanor's money either, but she trusted me with it, and I'm going to honor that trust. Victoria slammed her palm against the table, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the quiet room. Honor what trust? She was a bitter old woman playing favorites from beyond the grave. You think this makes you noble? You're destroying a family over money. The irony was so thick I almost choked on it. I'm destroying the family? Not the 15 years of exclusion, manipulation, and systematic erasure? Not the lies about family events I was never invited to? Not treating a grieving child like an inconvenience to be managed? We were protecting you, Patricia said, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. From what? From feeling loved? From belonging somewhere? From having a family that actually wanted me around? Harold Sterling cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention to him. If I may, there are additional provisions in Mrs. Chen's estate plan that you should all be aware of. He pulled out yet another document, this one bound in blue legal backing. Mrs. Chen established several trust funds and charitable foundations as part of her estate planning. The Deborah Chen Educational Foundation will provide scholarships for children who have lost parents. The Sandra Chen Memorial Fund will support grief counseling services for families. Both foundations are endowed with $10 million each. I felt the breath leave my lungs. Eleanor had created foundations in my name and my mother's name, ensuring that our legacy would be about helping others rather than accumulating wealth. Additionally, Sterling continued, Mrs. Chen made provisions for the family business. Chen Textiles will be transferred to new management under the direction of the Board of Trustees, with all profits beyond operational expenses going to support the foundations. Marcus went white. She's giving away the business? Our grandfather built that company from nothing. And your grandmother grew it into an empire, Sterling replied. She felt that converting it into a vehicle for charitable giving would honor both their memories. The room erupted. Ashley began crying, loud, dramatic sobs that sounded more like performance than genuine emotion. Victoria started pacing, her heels clicking against the hardwood like a metronome counting down to disaster. Marcus stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Patricia just stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Hatred, certainly, but there was something else there too. Recognition, maybe? The dawning realization that she'd underestimated the quiet girl she'd tried so hard to diminish. You planned this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You and Eleanor. This whole thing was planned. No, I replied, standing up slowly. Eleanor planned this. I had no idea until today what her will contained. But I'm not surprised by it, because unlike the rest of you, I actually knew her. Knew her? Victoria whirled around to face me. She was my grandmother. We had dinner with her every Sunday for 20 years. No, you had dinner with her every Sunday for 20 years. You showed up, ate her food, made polite conversation, and left as soon as it was socially acceptable. When was the last time any of you asked her about her childhood, about building the business with grandfather, about what it was like losing him? The silence that followed was answer enough. I walked to the window, looking out at Lake Michigan stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The water was gray-green today, choppy with whitecaps that caught the afternoon light. Eleanor had loved this view. She'd often told me that looking at the lake reminded her that there were things bigger than business, bigger than money, bigger than the petty dramas that consumed most people's lives.
She used to tell me stories, I said, not turning around, about coming to Chicago as a young woman, about meeting grandfather at that little restaurant in Chinatown, about building the business together, working 18-hour days, sleeping in the back office when they couldn't afford rent for both the business and an apartment. I could feel their attention on me, but I kept looking out at the water. She told me about her first big contract, supplying fabric to a department store chain. She stayed up for 3 days straight to meet the deadline, hand-sewing samples because they couldn't afford proper equipment yet. About the discrimination they faced, the banks that wouldn't give them loans, the suppliers who wouldn't sell to them because they were Chinese immigrants. I turned around to face them, and for the first time since I'd entered this room, I felt completely calm. She told me about the night grandfather died, how he made her promise to keep the business going, not for the money, but for the jobs it provided, the families it supported. She never saw the company as just a source of profit. She saw it as a responsibility. Marcus's face was red with anger, and something that might have been shame. So what? That makes you the rightful heir? Because you listened to a few old stories? It makes me someone who understood what the money actually meant to her, I replied, and someone she trusted to use it the way she would have wanted. Patricia stood up slowly, gathering her purse with the deliberate movements of someone trying to maintain dignity in the face of complete defeat. This isn't over, Deborah. We'll fight this in court. We'll tie up the estate for years if we have to. Harold Sterling spoke up from his position at the head of the table. Mrs. Chen, I should inform you that contesting this will would be both expensive and ultimately futile. Mrs. Chen's documentation is comprehensive, and her mental competency is thoroughly established. Moreover, she included a clause stating that any beneficiary who contests the will forfeits their inheritance entirely, including the $50,000. Patricia's face went through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous shade of purple. You're going to regret this, Deborah. All of you are going to regret this. She walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back one last time. Your mother would be ashamed of what you've become. The words were meant to cut deep, to find the vulnerable 7-year-old girl who still lived somewhere inside me. But they bounced off harmlessly because I knew something Patricia didn't. My mother would be proud that I survived you, I said quietly. Patricia's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the rage and frustration she'd been holding back for hours. You self-righteous little... Patricia! Marcus's voice cut through her tirade like a knife. Let's go. For once, his mother listened to him. She walked out without another word, Ashley trailing behind her like a designer-clad shadow. Victoria lingered for a moment, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I hope it was worth it, she said finally. It will be, I replied. And then they were gone, leaving me alone in the conference room with Harold Sterling and the weight of $50 million worth of responsibility settling on my shoulders like Eleanor's own hands, steady and sure and surprisingly warm. The silence that followed their departure was different from the tense quiet that had filled the room during the reading. This was the silence of the aftermath, heavy, profound, and strangely peaceful. I remained standing by the window, watching the late afternoon shadows stretch across Lake Michigan's restless surface.
Harold Sterling gathered his papers with the methodical precision of a man who'd witnessed countless family implosions over 4 decades of estate law. "Miss Chen," he said quietly, "there are practical matters we need to discuss regarding the transition of assets." I turned from the window, suddenly aware that the conference room felt enormous with just the two of us in it. The chairs where my family had sat seemed to retain the echo of their presence: Patricia's rigid posture, Marcus's nervous energy, Victoria's calculating stare. "I know this is overwhelming," Sterling continued, settling back into his chair. "Inheriting an estate of this magnitude involves complexities that most people never have to navigate." Overwhelming. The word felt inadequate to describe the sensation of having your entire life restructured in the span of 2 hours. I walked back to my chair and sat down, finally allowing myself to process what had just happened. "What exactly am I inheriting?" I asked. "Beyond the number 50 million, I mean. What does Eleanor's estate actually contain?" Sterling opened a different folder, this one containing what appeared to be property deeds and financial statements. "The primary residence in Lake Forest, a 7-bedroom estate on 3 acres, currently valued at approximately $4.2 million. The downtown penthouse where Mrs. Chen lived in her final years, $2.8 million. A vacation home in Door County, Wisconsin, $1.4 million. He turned to another page. "Chen Textiles, as I mentioned, will be converted to support the charitable foundations, but there are other business interests: a portfolio of commercial real estate throughout Chicago and Milwaukee, several restaurant investments, and a collection of blue-chip stocks that your grandmother accumulated over 60 years. The numbers began to blur together. I'd grown up in that Lake Forest house, but I'd never thought of it in terms of monetary value. It was just the place where I'd learned to ride a bike in the circular driveway, where I'd climbed the oak tree in the backyard, where I'd spent countless afternoons in Eleanor's study while she taught me to chess. There's also her personal collection," Sterling continued. "Artwork, jewelry, rare books, antique furniture. The jewelry alone is valued at over $2 million. Pieces collected during her travels with your grandfather, some dating back to the Kung dynasty." I thought of Eleanor's jade bracelet, the one she wore every day until arthritis made it too difficult to clasp. She'd promised to give it to me someday, though I'd never imagined it would come with $49 million worth of responsibility. "Miss Chen, I need to ask, do you have any experience managing significant financial assets?" The question was delicately phrased, but the implication was clear. I was a social worker who lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Wicker Park and drove a 7-year-old Honda Civic. The largest financial decision I'd ever made was choosing a 401k contribution percentage. "No," I admitted. "I balanced my checkbook and tried to save a little each month. That's about the extent of my financial expertise." Sterling nodded, seemingly unsurprised by my honesty. "Mrs. Chen anticipated this. She worked with my firm to establish a comprehensive support system for you. We've arranged for meetings with financial advisors, tax specialists, and wealth management professionals. Everything you'll need to make informed decisions about your inheritance." He handed me a business card with the name Rebecca Morrison, Certified Financial Planner, embossed in elegant script. "Rebecca worked closely with your grandmother for the past 15 years. She understands both the technical aspects of the estate and Mrs. Chen's philosophical approach to wealth management." I studied the card, trying to imagine sitting across from a financial advisor discussing investment strategies and asset allocation. A month ago, my biggest financial concern had been whether I could afford to replace the transmission on my car.
"There's something else," Sterling said, his tone shifting to something more personal. "Your grandmother left detailed instructions about her personal effects. She wanted you to go through everything yourself, to choose what has meaning for you before anything is donated or sold." The thought of walking through Eleanor's penthouse, touching her belongings, sorting through a lifetime of memories felt both sacred and overwhelming. When would I need to do that? "At your convenience. The properties are secure and there's no immediate timeline pressure." He paused, studying my face. "Miss Chen, if I may speak candidly, I've been handling estate law for 40 years, and I've rarely seen someone as thoroughly prepared for this moment as your grandmother was. She didn't just leave you money, she left you a roadmap for how to use it responsibly." I looked at him more carefully, noticing details I'd missed during the dramatic confrontation with my family. Harold Sterling had kind eyes behind his wire-rimmed glasses, and his voice carried the gentle authority of someone who'd spent decades helping people navigate life's most difficult transitions. Did you know her well? I asked. A smile creased the corners of his eyes. Eleanor was more than a client. She was a force of nature. She came to my office every quarter for the past 20 years, not just to review her estate plan, but to discuss the philosophical implications of wealth. She believed money was like water. It only had value when it was flowing, when it was being used to nourish something worthwhile. He leaned back in his chair, and for a moment, the formal attorney facade softened into something more human. She talked about you constantly, Miss Chen. Your work with disadvantaged children, your volunteer efforts at the literacy center, the way you chose a career based on service rather than salary. She saw in you the values that she and your grandfather had tried to instill in the family business. The weight of Eleanor's expectations settled over me like a mantle I wasn't sure I deserved. What if I can't live up to what she envisioned? What if I make mistakes with her money? Then you'll learn from those mistakes and do better next time, Sterling replied simply. Your grandmother didn't expect perfection, Miss Chen. She expected integrity. There's a significant difference. He closed the folder and looked at me directly. I should tell you, your family will likely attempt to contest this will, despite my warnings about the futility of such action. The process could take months, possibly years. During that time, the estate will be held in probate, and you won't have access to most of the assets. The relief I felt at this news surprised me. The prospect of immediately managing $50 million had felt like being asked to perform surgery without medical training. A gradual transition would give me time to prepare, to learn, to grow into the responsibility Eleanor had placed on my shoulders. What can I access during probate? Mrs. Chen established a separate trust specifically for this transition period. You'll have access to funds for living expenses, legal costs, and any immediate needs. The amount is sufficient to maintain a comfortable lifestyle without being overwhelming. He handed me another set of documents. These are the keys to the penthouse and the Lake Forest house. Mrs. Chen wanted you to have access to her personal belongings immediately, regardless of the legal status of the larger estate. I took the keys, their weight solid and real in my palm. The penthouse key was newer, with a modern electronic fob. The Lake Forest key was older, brass worn smooth by decades of use. I recognized it. Eleanor had carried this same key for as long as I'd known her. There's one more thing, Sterling said, reaching into his briefcase one final time. He withdrew a small wooden box, ornately carved with traditional Chinese patterns. She specifically requested that you receive this today. I opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside, nestled in red silk, was Eleanor's jade bracelet, the one she'd worn every day for 60 years. Beneath it lay a small folded note in her handwriting. For Deborah, may you wear this with the knowledge that you are loved beyond measure, and that with great privilege comes great responsibility to lift others as you have been lifted. Your path forward will not always be clear, but your heart will guide you true. All my love, Eleanor. I slipped the bracelet over my wrist, surprised by how perfectly it fit. The jade was warm against my skin, as if it retained some essence of the woman who'd worn it for so many years. Sterling watched me with the patience of someone who understood that some moments required silence to be fully absorbed. When I finally looked up, he was smiling. She knew you'd cry when you read that, he said gently. She also knew you'd stop crying and start planning how to honor her trust in you. He was right. The tears were already subsiding, replaced by something stronger, determination mixed with purpose, grief transformed into resolve. What's my first step? I asked. Go home, he said simply. Process what happened today. Tomorrow, we'll begin the practical work of managing your inheritance. But tonight, allow yourself to grieve the grandmother you lost and celebrate the woman you've become. I stood up, gathering my purse and the documents he'd given me. The conference room that had felt like a battleground 2 hours ago now felt like the starting point of something entirely new. Mr. Sterling, I said, as I reached the door, thank you, not just for handling the legal aspects, but for helping me understand what Eleanor really wanted. He inclined his head in acknowledgement. It was my honor, Miss Chen. Your grandmother was right about you. You're going to do extraordinary things with this gift. I walked toward the elevator, Eleanor's bracelet catching the light with each step. In the polished steel doors, I caught a glimpse of my reflection. The same navy blazer, the same pearl earrings, but something fundamental had changed. The woman looking back at me carried herself differently, stood taller, seemed to occupy space with newfound confidence.
The elevator descended 37 floors in the same silence as before, but now the quiet felt pregnant with possibility rather than dread. When the doors opened onto the marble lobby, I didn't hurry toward the exit. I stood for a moment, watching the late afternoon light filter through the tall windows, listening to the echo of my own footsteps in the vast space. Outside, Chicago bustled with its usual energy, cars honking, pedestrians hurrying toward the L, vendors calling out from street corners. The city looked exactly the same as it had this morning, but I was seeing it through different eyes now. I was no longer just Deborah Chen, the social worker from Wicker Clark. I was Eleanor Chen's granddaughter, the keeper of her legacy, the steward of resources that could change lives and lift communities. The responsibility felt enormous, but for the first time since I'd entered that conference room, it didn't feel impossible. It felt like coming home. 3 weeks later, I stood in the lobby of my apartment building in Wicker Park, surrounded by boxes and the strange sensation of preparing to leave a life that no longer fit. The small one-bedroom that had been my sanctuary for 5 years now felt like a borrowed costume I was finally ready to return. My neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, peeked out from behind her door, her curious eyes taking in the moving boxes stacked in the hallway. "You sure about this, mija? That place is awfully big for one person." She was talking about the Lake Forest house, Eleanor's house, which would soon become mine, at least temporarily. The penthouse felt too overwhelming, too much like stepping into Eleanor's shoes before I was ready. But the Lake Forest estate held different memories. It was where I'd spent summers as a child, where Eleanor had taught me to garden in the greenhouse, where I'd learned that wealth didn't have to mean coldness. "I need the space to figure things out," I told Mrs. Rodriguez, which was only partially true. What I really needed was distance from the life I'd known, room to grow into the person Eleanor believed I could become.
The moving truck arrived precisely at 9, driven by a cheerful man named Tony who seemed genuinely excited to be moving someone to one of those fancy places out by the lake. I'd hired a small crew, just enough to transport my modest belongings to a house that had 32 rooms. As we loaded my secondhand furniture and thrift store decorations into the truck, I caught myself wondering what Patricia would think when she learned I was moving into the family home. The house she'd redecorated to erase my mother's presence. The house where she'd relegated me to the smallest bedroom, while her children enjoyed suites with private bathrooms. But those thoughts felt distant now, like remembering a movie I'd watched years ago. The anger that had sustained me for so long was transforming into something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of peaceful detachment. The drive to Lake Forest took 45 minutes through Chicago's northern suburbs, past strip malls and McMansions, until the lots grew larger and the houses began to hide behind gates and mature landscaping. I followed the moving truck in my Honda, Eleanor's jade bracelet warm against my wrist, watching familiar landmarks blur past the windows. When we turned onto Sheridan Road, my stomach tightened with anticipation. I hadn't been back to the house since Eleanor's funeral 3 months ago, when Patricia had made it clear that family gatherings would be restructured to accommodate new circumstances. The iron gates stood open, just as they had when I was a child racing my bike up the circular driveway. The oak trees that lined the drive had grown fuller in the years since I'd lived here, their branches forming a cathedral arch over the asphalt. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, though that might have been the perspective of adulthood rather than any physical change. The house itself remained as imposing as ever, red brick and limestone, with tall windows that caught the morning light and reflected it back like welcoming beacons. The gardens Patricia had so carefully maintained showed signs of neglect in Eleanor's final months, though professional landscapers had clearly been making an effort to keep things from complete wilderness. Tony whistled low as he climbed out of the truck. "Lady, this place is like something from a magazine." I walked up the front steps, key in hand, remembering all the times I'd raced up these same stairs as a child. The brass lion door knocker was tarnished but still dignified, still guarding a home that had sheltered 4 generations of the Chen family. The key turned smoothly, and the front door swung open on silent hinges. The foyer stretched before me, unchanged since my childhood. Marble floors with intricate inlays, a crystal chandelier that cast rainbow prisms on the walls,
a sweeping staircase that curved toward the second floor like something from a movie set. But without Eleanor's presence, without the sounds of daily life, the space felt more like a museum than a home. My footsteps echoed as I walked through rooms filled with covered furniture and memories I'd tried to forget. The living room, where Patricia had held her charity committee meetings while pointedly excluding me from family photos. The dining room, where I'd sat at the far end of the table during holiday meals, close enough to hear the conversation, but far enough away to feel invisible. But there were other memories too, older ones, that Patricia's renovations had never quite erased. The kitchen, where Eleanor and I had baked cookies on rainy afternoons. The library, where she'd read to me before bed when my father was too busy or too sad to manage bedtime routines. The sunroom, where we'd played chess and she'd told me stories about building the business with my grandfather. I found myself walking toward Eleanor's study, drawn by muscle memory and the faint scent of her perfume that seemed to linger in the hallways. The door was closed, but when I turned the handle, it opened onto a room that time had preserved like amber. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. The mahogany desk where she'd managed family finances well into her 80s, the leather chair where she'd sit with her morning tea and the Wall Street Journal, the photographs lining the mantelpiece above the fireplace. Those photographs told the story Patricia had tried so hard to erase. My grandmother as a young woman, standing beside my grandfather outside their first textile shop. My parents on their wedding day, my mother radiant in white silk, my father looking like he couldn't believe his good fortune. Me as a baby in my mother's arms, both of us laughing at something just outside the camera's range. There were newer photos too, my college graduation, where Eleanor had sat in the front row because my father had been too busy with a business trip to attend. A picture from my 25th birthday dinner, just the two of us at her favorite restaurant downtown. A candid shot someone had taken of us working in the greenhouse last summer, both of us covered in soil and grinning at the camera. Looking at these images, I realized that Eleanor had been documenting a different family history. Not the sanitized version Patricia preferred, but the real one, with all its messiness and love and loss. Tony's voice from the foyer interrupted my reverie. "Ma'am, where would you like us to start putting things?" I walked back to meet the movers, suddenly aware of how inadequate my belongings would look scattered throughout this vast space. My IKEA bookshelf would look ridiculous in the library. My second-hand couch would disappear in the formal living room. My collection of coffee mugs would rattle around the china cabinet like marbles in a jewelry box. "Let's start with the blue bedroom upstairs," I said, directing them toward the room that had been mine as a child. "We can figure out the rest as we go." As the movers carried my life up the curved staircase, I walked through the house more methodically, taking inventory of what I'd inherited along with the property deed. Patricia's decorating touches were everywhere: neutral colors, expensive fabrics, artwork chosen more for status than personal meaning. But underneath her improvements, I could still see traces of the home my mother had helped create. A hand-painted tile in the kitchen that my mother had chosen during renovations, crown molding in the dining room that bore the scuff marks from when I'd tried to measure my height against it as a 7-year-old. A stained glass window in the stairwell landing that caught the afternoon light and painted rainbow patterns on the wall, just as it had when I was small. The house was huge, far too big for one person, but it wasn't empty. It was full of history, full of stories, full of the accumulated love and loss of everyone who had ever called it home. Even Patricia's attempts to erase certain chapters couldn't diminish the deeper narrative embedded in its walls. By evening, my belongings had been distributed throughout the house like seeds scattered in a garden bed. My clothes hung in the walk-in closet of the blue bedroom, looking lost among the built-in shelving and cedar drawers. My books filled exactly one shelf in the library, leaving dozens of others empty and waiting. My kitchen supplies occupied a single cabinet in a space designed to serve formal dinner parties for 50 people. The movers left just as the sun was setting, their truck disappearing down the drive with a friendly honk of farewell. Suddenly, I was alone, in a house that seemed to hold its breath around me, waiting to see what I would do with all this space, all this possibility. I made dinner in the enormous kitchen, pasta from a jar of sauce I'd brought from my apartment, ate at the breakfast nook while the formal dining room remained shrouded in darkness. The silence was profound, but not oppressive. It felt expectant, like the pause before a symphony begins. After dinner, I walked through the house again, turning on the lights in each room. The electricity bills alone would probably cost more than my old rent, but I wanted to see every corner to understand the full scope of what Eleanor had entrusted to me.
In the master bedroom, Eleanor's room, I found a surprise. On the nightstand sat a small wrapped package with my name written in her distinctive handwriting. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages blank and ready for whatever story I was about to write. The first page bore an inscription: "For Deborah, your journey is just beginning. Document it well so that someday you can help another lost girl find her way home. All my love, Eleanor." I sat on the edge of her bed, holding the journal and looking out the window at the lake in the distance. The water was dark now, invisible except where moonlight caught the occasional wave. In the morning, I would be able to see the horizon from here, would wake up to the sight of infinite possibility stretching beyond the shore. For the first time in 3 weeks, since that day in the conference room when my world had shifted on its axis, I allowed myself to fully feel the weight of what had happened. Eleanor was gone. My family, what was left of it, had revealed their true nature and walked away. I was alone in a house worth millions of dollars, responsible for a fortune I'd never wanted and a legacy I wasn't sure I deserved. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Sitting in Eleanor's room, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of a woman who had built an empire from nothing, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my mother's death 25 years earlier. I felt like I was home. Tomorrow, I would begin the real work of understanding my inheritance, of learning to manage wealth responsibly, of figuring out how to honor Eleanor's trust while staying true to my own values. I would meet with financial advisors and lawyers, would tour the foundations she'd established in my name and my mother's name, and would begin the slow process of transforming money into meaning. But tonight, I would sleep in the house where I'd learned to ride a bicycle and climb trees and believe that love could survive loss. Tonight, I would rest in the knowledge that Eleanor had seen something in me worth betting $50 million on. And tomorrow, I will start proving her right. 6 months after that rain-soaked morning at Sterling and Associates, I stood in the renovated community center on Chicago's South Side, watching 12-year-old Maria carefully sound out the words in her first chapter book. The afternoon sunlight streamed through new windows, casting warm rectangles across reading tables that still smelled faintly of fresh pine. "The girl walked through the forest," Maria read slowly, her finger tracing each syllable. When she reached the end of the page, she looked up with the kind of pure satisfaction that comes from conquering something difficult. "I did it, Miss Deborah." "You absolutely did," I said, settling into the small chair beside her. "How does it feel to read a whole page by yourself?" Maria's smile could have powered the entire building. "Like I'm magic." The Sandra Chen Memorial Literacy Center had opened 3 months ago, funded by Eleanor's Foundation and staffed by reading specialists who understood that learning wasn't just about academics, it was about believing in your own potential. We served kids from the neighborhood, many of them navigating the same challenges I'd faced as a child: loss, instability, adults too overwhelmed by their only struggles to provide consistent support. "Maria," called Miss Patterson from across the room, "your aunt is here to pick you up." As Maria gathered her books and backpack, she turned to me with the serious expression she wore whenever she had something important to say. "Miss Deborah, when I grow up, I want to help kids learn to read too." "I think you'd be wonderful at that," I told her, meaning every word. After the children left for the day, I walked through the center's quiet rooms, still amazed by how quickly dreams could become reality when you had resources to back them up. The Literacy Center was just one of 7 community programs the Foundation had launched, but it was the one closest to my heart. Every afternoon spent here reminded me why Eleanor had trusted me with her legacy. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca Morrison, my financial advisor. "Board meeting tomorrow at 2 p.m. Budget approval for the housing initiative. You ready?" Ready.
The question had followed me through 6 months of learning to manage wealth I'd never imagined possessing. Was I ready to approve a $10 million affordable housing project? Was I ready to hire 30 new employees for the foundations? Was I ready to use Eleanor's money to change lives on a scale I was still struggling to comprehend? The answer was the same one I'd given Eleanor that day in her penthouse when she'd asked if I thought I could handle the responsibility. I was ready to try. The drive back to Lake Forest took me through neighborhoods I'd learned to navigate as part of my new life. Areas where the foundation was building playgrounds and funding after-school programs, communities where Eleanor's textile fortune was being transformed into hope one project at a time. The house on Sheridan Road no longer felt like a museum. Over the past months, I'd slowly made it mine, not by erasing Patricia's changes, but by layering my own story on top of them. The formal dining room now hosted monthly dinners for foundation board members and community partners. The library served as my home office, its shelves gradually filling with books on nonprofit management, urban development, and education policy. The greenhouse had become my sanctuary, where I grew vegetables that I donated to local food pantries and tended flowers that reminded Eleanor's love for beauty in everyday life. I found Harold Sterling waiting in the living room when I arrived, his briefcase resting beside Eleanor's favorite armchair. Over the past months, he'd become more than just my attorney. He was a mentor, a connection to Eleanor, and one of the few people who understood the weight of inheriting not just money, but the responsibility that came with it. "Good evening, Miss Chen," he said, rising as I entered. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I have some news that requires immediate attention." I settled into the chair across from him, noting the tension in his usually calm demeanor. "What's happened?" "What's happened?" "Your stepfamily has made their move," he said simply. "After months of legal posturing, they've filed a comprehensive lawsuit challenging Eleanor's mental competency, your influence over her, and the validity of her entire estate plan." I'd been expecting this news for months, but it still hit me like a physical blow. How bad is it? Sterling opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick legal document. "They're claiming undue influence, alleging that you manipulated Eleanor's medical care to ensure favorable psychiatric evaluations and questioning the timing of her will changes. They've hired Morrison Blackwell and Associates, one of Chicago's most aggressive litigation firms." Morrison Blackwell and Associates. I even recognize that name. They were the lawyers you hired when you wanted to destroy your opponent rather than simply win your case. "They're also seeking an immediate injunction to freeze all foundation activities until the estate is resolved," Sterling continued. "If they succeed, every program you've launched would have to shut down pending the outcome of litigation that could take years. The Reading Center, the Housing Initiative, the scholarship program that was sending kids like Maria to college, all of it could disappear while lawyers argue about Eleanor's state of mind and my motives." "What do we do?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Sterling smiled grimly. "We fight, and we have weapons they don't know we possess." He reached into his briefcase again and withdrew a manila envelope I'd never seen before. "Your grandmother left one final surprise, a video deposition recorded 2 weeks before her death, specifically addressing the possibility of this exact challenge." He handed me the envelope, Eleanor's handwriting on the front. "For Deborah, in case they still don't understand."
Inside was a USB drive and a letter dated just days before Eleanor's final hospital admission. My hands trembled slightly as I read her familiar script. "My dearest Deborah, if you're reading this, then my other grandchildren have chosen litigation over acceptance, greed over grace. I am not surprised. I recorded this deposition with Harold's help because I knew they would question my mental state, your character, and my decisions. I wanted to leave no doubt about my reasoning or my capacity to make these choices. Show them this recording when they push too hard. Show them what clarity actually looks like. All my love, Eleanor." Sterling connected the USB drive to his laptop and positioned the screen where we both could see it. Eleanor's face appeared, thin from illness but unmistakably alert, sitting in her penthouse with Lake Michigan visible through the windows behind her. "My name is Eleanor Chen," her recorded voice said, clear and strong despite her physical frailty. I am 86 years old, and I am making this statement of my own free will, in the presence of my attorney Harold Sterling and 2 independent witnesses, to address any challenges that may arise regarding my final will and testament. She looked directly into the camera with the same penetrating gaze that had made business rivals squirm for 60 years. I am leaving the majority of my estate to my granddaughter Deborah Chen because she is the only member of my family who has consistently demonstrated the values my late husband and I tried to instill: compassion, integrity, and the understanding that wealth is a tool for service, not merely personal gratification. The recording continued for 27 minutes, with Eleanor methodically addressing every potential challenge to her decisions. She discussed specific incidents of my stepfamily's behavior over the years, cited dates and witnesses, and demonstrated a memory for detail that would impress a prosecutor. She explained her reasoning for each bequest, her hopes for the foundations, and her absolute confidence in my character. Most devastatingly, she addressed Patricia directly. You believed that by excluding Deborah from family events and treating her as an inconvenience, you could make her disappear from my consideration. Instead, you only highlighted the contrast between her grace under pressure and your own petty cruelties. You taught her to be self-reliant, while your own children learned to be dependent. You gave her the greatest gift possible, the knowledge that she could survive and thrive without anyone's approval. For that, I suppose I should thank you. When the recording ended, Sterling and I sat in silence for several minutes. Even months after her death, Eleanor could still command a room. "This changes everything," Sterling said finally. "With this deposition, their case becomes not just weak but potentially frivolous. We can seek sanctions against their attorneys for bringing a baseless challenge. Will that stop them?" "It will end them," he replied with satisfaction. "No reputable firm wants to be sanctioned for filing frivolous lawsuits. They'll withdraw their challenge and recommend their clients accept the original estate distribution." Over the next 3 weeks, the legal battle played out exactly as Sterling had predicted. When Eleanor's deposition was presented to the court, Patricia's attorneys immediately requested a private conference. Within days, the lawsuit was withdrawn with prejudice, meaning it could never be filed again. The victory felt hollow at first. I'd won, but only because Eleanor had anticipated my family's betrayal so thoroughly that she'd prepared evidence from beyond the grave. The sadness of that reality, that she'd known they would choose money over relationships, weighed on me for weeks. But gradually, I began to understand that the lawsuit had been a gift of sorts. It had forced me to articulate publicly why I deserved Eleanor's trust, to defend not just my inheritance, but the values that had earned it. In fighting for Eleanor's wishes, I'd finally found my own voice. The foundation work expanded rapidly after the legal threat ended. The Literacy Center became a model replicated in 6 other Chicago neighborhoods. The Affordable Housing Initiative broke ground on its first development, creating homes for families who'd been priced out of gentrifying areas. The scholarship program grew to support 500 students annually. But the project I was most proud of was the newest one, a mentorship program pairing successful professionals with kids aging out of foster care. It addressed the same isolation I'd felt after my mother's death, the same sense of navigating life without a roadmap that had defined so much of my childhood. On the first anniversary of Eleanor's death, I stood in the greenhouse behind the Lake Forest house, tending the orchids she'd loved so much. The plants had nearly died in the months after her passing, but with patience and proper care, they'd begun to bloom again, delicate purple flowers that caught the morning light like stained glass. My phone rang as I was misting the leaves. The caller ID showed Patricia's name, the first time she'd contacted me since that disastrous day at Sterling's office. "Hello, Patricia," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Deborah." Her voice was different, smaller somehow, stripped of the commanding tone she'd used throughout my childhood. "I wanted to call and to tell you that I saw the article in the Tribune about the Literacy Center." The Chicago Tribune had run a feature about the Foundation's work, including interviews with children whose lives had been changed by our programs.
Maria had been featured prominently, photographed reading to younger children with the kind of confidence that came from believing in her own intelligence. "It's good work you're doing," Patricia continued, the words seeming to cost her something. Eleanor would be proud.
Thank you, I said, because there was nothing else to say. I know I wasn't. I know I didn't handle things well when you were growing up. I was young and scared, and I thought there wasn't enough room for all of us to be important in Robert's life. It was the closest thing to an apology I would ever get from her, and I found that I didn't need more. We all made mistakes, Patricia, I said, and I meant it. After she hung up, I continued tending Eleanor's orchids, thinking about forgiveness and growth and the difference between understanding someone's behavior and excusing it. Patricia's call wouldn't change the past or rebuild the relationships her choices had destroyed, but it represented something valuable, the acknowledgement that different choices had been possible. That evening, I sat in Eleanor's study, updating the journal she'd given me on my first night in the house. The blank pages had gradually filled with the story of learning to manage wealth responsibly, of building programs that changed lives, of discovering that Eleanor's real gift hadn't been money, but the confidence to use it well. I wrote about Maria and the dozens of other children who'd learned to believe in their own potential. I documented the families moving into affordable housing units that would never have existed without Eleanor's textile fortune. I recorded the success stories of foster children who'd found mentors and college scholarships and the support they needed to build stable lives. The story I was writing in Eleanor's journal wasn't about inheriting $50 million. It was about inheriting the responsibility to use privilege in service of others, about learning that true wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts, but in lives improved and communities strengthened. As I closed the journal and prepared for bed, I looked out at Lake Michigan stretching dark and infinite beyond the windows. Somewhere out there, in the city's neighborhoods and communities, Eleanor's legacy was growing and changing and touching lives in ways we'd never be able to fully measure. I thought about the scared 7-year-old girl who'd lost her mother and spent the next 2 decades feeling like an outsider in her own family. That girl couldn't have imagined the woman I'd become. Confident, purposeful, surrounded by meaningful work and genuine relationships. But Eleanor had seen that potential even when I couldn't. She'd bet $50 million on the belief that love and loss could be transformed into service and hope. She'd trusted that the girl who'd survived abandonment and neglect could become the woman who'd ensure other children didn't face those challenges alone. In the end, that trust had been the real inheritance, not the money, but the absolute conviction that I was capable of honoring it. And every day, in reading centers and housing developments and scholarship awards ceremonies, I got to prove her right. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.